The Paula Show is on. The Paula Show. Come on, one and all. I extend an invitation to the Paula Show. Join in the conversation. Transforming behavior, recognizing our savior, overcoming hurdles, achieving dreams. Together we can succeed.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Paula Show. In part one of our conversation about slavery, emancipation, and reparation, we spoke about slavery in Africa, the Middle Passage, purchasing slaves at the auction, and tonight our conversation will continue about life on the plantation, religion, black slave owners, punishment, and revolt. If you live
It's
or
at the
die,
benevolence of your master.
you don't even have a choice in the matter.
Precisely.
I mean, there's no dignity. There's just
Precisely.
no anything. You
Precisely.
just, you're not living. You're existing.
Yes.
Oh,
You're existing for the time.
You know, I have my donkey, I have my cattle, I have my slave, I have my
All
goat
of them
and
are
my
practically
sheep.
the same thing.
Yes.
Same thing.
well, don't worry, because there are people at this particular time in history who value animals more than they value
And that's
people.
sad.
Yes?
Yes.
I have said that if that police officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck, had it on a pit bull, had it on
Somebody would
other
have stopped
dog,
him.
Oh, he would have been in jail a
trust
long
me,
time.
he would have been instantly apprehended. It would not have taken Black Lives Matter and all of that. How dare him put his knee on the neck of a dog or a cat and cause its death? No, man. He would have been a goner. You understand? So there are people at this current age, in this current age, who value the lives of their pets and even stray animals more than they value the lives of
a
us,
human being.
even though we are professionals
Yes.
and look well together. Dollar, and me darker, quart.
Actually, it'd be $2. The darker the slave, the greater the worth.
It's true.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
So
about that.
I'm not sure about that.
I've
but
actually
you
read
would
it in a lot
be,
of textbooks.
you would be,
I would be in the
you would-
be in the field and you guys would be in the master's house.
Yeah, but the fact that you're blacker means you can work harder. And you're more resistant to sun.
and male slaves tended to be a
Yes.
little bit more pricey as well too.
Yes.
Especially
But
if
I'm
they're
not
skilled
male.
slave.
But it don't
No,
matter.
so
But the blacker the better. So you
In the
mean
sun.
I would be more valuable than you guys? Wow.
better if you were skilled.
Yeah. Because some of the artisan slaves, I think.
Well,
paid
my
as
They
skill
were,
they
yeah.
wouldn't like. They would kill me because they would say I talk too much.
Oh, I said
Well, they'll
that
put you in the
already.
field. They'll put you in the field so that you wouldn't.
I
whatever
would
you
create
say.
so much revolt, but we're
Yeah.
coming to that in a minute.
Oh, I'm going to get plenty, Bill.
Okay.
We need to understand what is a slave, what makes a person a slave and not a free man. And there are basically four things that one has to look at when you're thinking about a slave.
Tell me, because I'm thinking of a million. Go ahead. Just four?
And when I do this with my children at school, they say, but I am a slave? It sounds like I am a slave. And I'll explain that to you as
Until
well.
you're 18.
Very good. One, you don't have any rights to kinship ties. You don't have any right to have a family. You don't have any right to a legal personality. You can't have any, the law is not on your side. You don't have the right to movement. You don't have the right to earn property, to own property. Anything that you have or you're able to acquire, if you have kinship ties, it is at the benevolence of your master.
You like that word.
Yes, I
And
love that
hate it in
word.
slavery.
I
You
like
have
to
use
use
it.
because you know it's a punchline, really. It's at the benevolence. I'm being very sarcastic here. It would be at the benevolence of your master.
So there are reports that slave ships docked at Fort James.
Yes, I heard that. I have not seen any evidence of it.
So it's oral
I'm not
history?
saying no. I'm not saying that there isn't any evidence. I'm saying I have not seen that.
The water that we know St. John's Harbor, where you have the cruise ships, etc.
And it wasn't like that.
That's dead water.
Yeah.
Essentially, there's no wind to push a ship in and out. So at that point in time, if a ship doesn't have its own internal power, it couldn't come out of the harbor. if it
Right.
came
They have to
in.
use canoes.
So what they had to do, you have the very big ships, they would stay out there.
Right.
And then they would transport the slaves to a smaller boat and then
Precisely.
bring them in.
I know about
the
that.
island.
I know about that one.
But you do also know that there's a cottage behind Big Banana
Yes.
in St. John's, the
Yes.
existing Big Banana, where slaves were shackled to
Yes,
be
the
sold.
coat
And
cottage.
I understand the indentations are still there in the
in
wall.
the stone, yes. And there is a little gate at the back, and that is where the slaves were taken through to go onto the auction block.
And someone said on the right, when you're traveling towards Sir Vivian Richards Stadium,
Yes.
where slaves were also
There was an
auctioned,
auction block. There was an auction block there as well.
and then they were dispersed to various
Plantations
plantations.
all
Once you
over
pay
the
the money,
island.
then
Once
you
you pay the
get the
money,
slave.
yes, you got the slave.
Interestingly, they had an orientation and a mentoring program, because when the new slaves arrived at the plantation, they were placed in the care of another slave.
And
It's
it's
called
called the seasoning
You're
period.
seasoning them.
Yes,
Or,
you're seasoning
or you
them.
you need
But
to
that
hear.
seasoning doesn't sound like when you season your pot, because when
That's
you
what my
season-
students say.
well, I'm thinking like your students. When you season your
You're
pot, it's
seasoning them
flavored
to the work of
and
the
it's
estate.
tasty. But this seasoning wasn't tasty.
What
It's
you're
not tasty to
doing
you, but
is-
it's tasteful to them.
To
Because
whom?
the slave master, I'm seasoning you to the work of the plantation. So here it is. One, you're learning the language, because of course most of them
Yes,
would have
you
come
have
with
to
their
learn the language.
African dialects.
Been
Their
changed.
names would have been changed. So you would have been
And-
given the title whatsoever Thomas, whatsoever Charles, Codrington, depending on the last name of your master, of course. So all
And-
that.
And in the seasoning, you're telling me my lips are thick.
you're
That is a
ugly.
part
I'm
of it.
ugly.
Then they begin to make a slave. They need to make you into a slave.
They
But I'm
emotional
Because
already
you-
a slave.
No.
You brought me across
No.
the Atlantic.
No.
You've degraded
You're
me.
They
kidnapped
now need to
human.
enslave you.
You're a kidnapped human. But remember, enslavement was mental.
They need to make you a slave now. And in making you a slave, when we talk about seasoning, we're talking about creolizing you. You still have the hope in you that you're going to go back to Africa, you know. And all of this trauma is telling you, you ain't going back nowhere, so you better get used to this. And so they would creolize you now. They change your name. They change your, so if you're Nzinga, you're now Angela, you know. And I don't want to be called Angela.
And Angela Thomas, too, because that's the
Angela,
name of the
yes,
master.
you know, and then you have to go through, you know,
Indoctrination.
you have to go through the induction, and whoever it is that is mentoring you there, they have to teach you. You can't try and kill the master, because if you do, they're gonna kill you. And so you begin to learn.
But why do you have to tell the person you're black, you're
Fear.
ugly, you're
No, because slavery is about control. If you, and it's similar to Stockholm syndrome. If you want to have somebody who's pliant on your field, you have to destroy them mentally. And so the
So I might be
planter-
coming from Africa, where I was part of a larger population of
Yes,
black
and
people.
proud
so I
of
was
yourself.
feeling important.
You have a
and
self-identity
proud.
and all of that.
So now you have to break me down.
And-
Precisely.
And that's what seasoning is for.
And-
Seasoning is the emotional, the psychological breakdown. That's where it really happens. We are literally, I'm
Why you call
changing
it
you from
season?
Anzinga to Angela. I am telling you who you were, you are no longer. You are now this and this. You will be until they don't kill you.
The process of enslaving this person, it's psychological, and what that person would do when they realize that there is no going back, there is nothing,
Then they conform.
in order to save themselves as well as their
Sanity.
children, they pass it on.
You can understand then why sometimes people still behave defeated.
Yes,
Psychologically, the emotions must have been passed on,
I believe
just
so.
like the diseases.
A lot of our actions are transgenerational, you know.
But this is what I'm talking about.
And we really need to begin. We're only 180 something years after
Emancipation.
emancipation, and This is 400 years we're talking about.
So you hear the cries are still resonating in
Yep.
your head. You're black, you're ugly, your hips are too broad, your thighs are too thick. You're supposed to look like someone on Vogue.
Yeah, but then
And
when
the
he's
audacity
finished,
of
when
black
he's finished, he
people.
will still, when he's finished and when the planter is finished saying all of that to degrade, especially the woman, oh, she's too sensual and you're this and you're that. In the nights, you know, you see comfort from those very same legs. Between
Yes. I remember going to primary school. I had one particular primary school teacher named Miss Watkins. I remember she used to tell us, why is it that you do not respond to instruction unless I stand up in front of the class with a belt? You have to be driven to do work.
Like
you should have to be
slaves, yeah.
driven to do work. It should be something independent.
Coming off of the ugly and the thick lips and the broad nose and all of that, I just have to make a point here
Yes.
that we are beautiful
Oh,
people.
extremely.
Yes.
Beautiful people with
Beautiful
smooth
skin.
black skin. Well, not you guys.
It doesn't matter. But you see, but the thing is, it doesn't really matter for me. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. I had a student some years ago, and he had challenges, you know. But he was a bright young man, but he had challenges, and his complexion was dark, and I always thought that he was so beautiful. But he sat down. He was in fourth form, and he sat down with me. And he was talking to me. He said, Miss Black, do you know why I do history? I said, no, I don't know why. Because it was difficult for him to handle the history. It's because you made me love my color. You made me love who I am. He said, when I was little, people used to tease me about my blackness. And you made me love my blackness.
Thank you for staying with us on part 2 of our program about slavery, emancipation, and reparation. Miss Angella Black is here, and so too is Mr. KamaliMannix. They're both historians. Slaves that survived, they arrived at various plantations across the Americas. So the adult slaves are in the field, and what are the children doing? Sleeping?
Yes,
If they bring children, little children, it was not
Maybe
the norm, because they
teenagers.
wanted to get teenagers or young adults
going up.
So if there were children on the plantation, it would have been after the slaves settled in and
Most
reproduced.
likely,
reproduced.
I'm not saying that that no children ever came across
Yes.
the Middle Passage.
But
I'm
it
not saying
wasn't
that,
the
but it
practice.
wasn't a large. I don't think it was a very, very large amount.
But for those children who were living on the plantation, because clearly they were children on the plantation,
Yeah, they would
weren't
begin-
expected to be in the fields.
Not at that age, not at 5, not at before 5, but afterward at 5, you begin to learn how to do a little weeding, how to
Taking
do a
up
little
some
thing.
cane trash.
Yeah, you
moving
begin
this
to learn
here,
to do these things.
Feeding some cows, tying them
Yeah.
out in the pasture.
Yeah,
they
playing
wouldn't
with the
give them-
master's
So they
children.
wouldn't give them the full-on work.
They wouldn't
But they're going to start to tell them, look, this is going to be your lot in life, eh?
Yes.
So you just start to learn
Understand
the
you're a
ways
little
of
slave. So
you're in
your
training.
state.
Yes.
So you're in training.
So from,
whereas
but
a
they're
big
not
slave-
sunset to sunrise to sunset
Not
work.
necessarily.
No, not with the
The
children
adults.
yet. The adults would be that.
And you know, the playmates of the masters, etc.,
Yes.
etc. So I remember one of the movies that is very popular about slavery is Roots. And I remember one of the slaves was taught by the master's child how to write and to read. And I remember it was a big issue because, of course, slaves are supposed to be the dumbest thing on earth. And so you did have that relationship happening between slaves. And, you know, sometimes it started from a very early age. You had a situation where if I am raised on my father's, let's say my father dies and I take over, then this slave then becomes my closest confidant and literally lives in the great house and has sometimes equal authority to even me because I grew up with this person. And so it did happen.
Companionship was a problem in some instances because I understand the masses will want to pair a male and a female together, but you haven't gotten over your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your husband or your wife that's in Africa. And he wants you to be coupled with someone on the plantation.
You know, the master was in charge of everything, and so everything...
Even their sex life?
Even their sex life, they were in charge of everything. A great evil was done against the enslaved people in the Americas. If you can think of an atrocity that happened against a slave, it probably happened once
This
in
is
a
not
society,
an
at least once.
atrocity, but I understand that a slave master, unusual situation, he loved his black male slave dearly, and so he gave him to a particular lady, and the lady didn't particularly like the gentleman, and because the master wanted children, I mean, eventually she had to submit.
If they got pregnant for somebody they didn't want to, once they had the knowledge, they could have bought the baby.
They knew which
They have
bush to
plenty
use,
of old
what
wives
things
fables.
to eat.
Some of the old wives fables are not old wives
Right.
fables.
I think
They
the
knew how
most
to. They knew what to do. A lot of them came from Africa. They had bush
knowledge,
bush
the
knowledge, and they
medicine.
knew what to use. So even though maybe the plants in Africa were totally different from the plants here in wherever they were,
could
because I'm speaking
recognize
for the
the
whole of
qualities,
Americas,
yes.
they probably eventually recognized, hey, this existed there, it's here, I could try this. But many of them aborted their babies, and Africans have been known to kill themselves too. They have been known to commit infanticide and suicide as well.
Kill their children and kill themselves.
Yes, because they don't.
They don't
When
want
the
their children
baby is
to live the
born, they
same
do
house.
not want the baby to go through slavery, and so
Yes.
if they couldn't get rid of the baby for an abortion, some were known to have killed the baby.
Plantation life, some may say, wasn't all bad.
Oh,
It depended on
You
the
had
benevolence
house
of your
benevolence
master.
of the master. The benevolence of
It
the master.
depended on the benevolence
you
of
guys
the
stop
No,
saying
because
that?
it's serious. Because, for example, you had some masters who would say Sunday to Sunday you go work. So
See,
as long as
until
the
the law
sun
was
that
passed,
God
until
makes
the law
rises,
was passed.
you will work. You had some masters who would say, you know what, I will give you a little break on a
day
Saturday
off.
and a Sunday. Or maybe on a Sunday you can rest for a few hours. You had some who had particular times that they would allow you to work, maybe from 6 to 6. You had some that say from the time God's sun rise until God sets his sun, you will work. And if little light still there after he set, you work a little extra hour
So when
or
it's the
so.
summer months and it's
So you know you're
lighter,
working extra
it's
long.
until 7.
Let me just interject here. One time in Antigua, it was customary for the planters to give their slaves. It wasn't law yet. It was customary for the planters to give their slaves Christmas Day and Boxing Day. And in 1701, the name of the planter eludes me. He did not give his slaves the right to have their vacation. And they walk into the house. I can only imagine they walking into the house and saying to the missus, "Good morning, ma'am." Chop off the man's head. Walk out. This in Antigua.
Yeah.
Walked out of the house.
great
Of course,
house.
eventually they caught the slaves and killed them and executed them.
Yes.
You know? But
But
that
they were-
happened.
But they were like,
But
the audacity of
that-
this man.
tell me, I can't have my customary holidays. But that action eventually led up to Antiguan, the people, the planters in Antigua, to make it law for Christmas Day and Boxing Day
Because they were so afraid of their own
to be
lives.
a public holiday.
Yes.
Because they don't want to die.
One of the interesting things that I found about plantation life, I remember meeting a man in the United States, he's from Barbados, and he told me his father was what we would call the village ram. And he said because for every single parish in Barbados, I think Barbados is about 16, he had a brother. He said when he became a teacher, he was teaching first form, taught a child his last name Williams. And it's only when he became an older adult, he realized he was teaching his brother. And you realize that that isn't something that just popped up in the Caribbean. It was something that was taught. Because you had certain estates where the goal wasn't exactly to produce sugar. The goal was to produce slaves. So you had breeders. So a master will look for the tall, black, strong, strapping man.
Good genes.
Right, good genes. And you have 5 houses with 5 different females. And he's going to tell him, you're going to this hut tonight, you're going to that hut tonight, you're going to the other one, you're going to the other one. And his main responsibility, he doesn't do anything on the estate besides reproduce.
So he doesn't
So
work
he-
in the
And
field and all of
this-
that?
and
He just
this
goes into the
happened-
huts and
this
make
happened.
babies.
This happened more after 1807 when the slave trade was abolished, because before they were not too keen on reproduction. They were keen on replacing. But after 1807 and the slave trade ended
They
in
needed to have
Britain,
a natural
they then need
increase.
to have natural increase, and so they would be so proud of a woman. They would say to a slave woman, if you have the amount of children you have, you get less work to do. And it's the same thing
More
with men.
privileges.
Yeah, and then you would have your breeder slave.
What a lot hasn't changed since slavery, you know.
Yes,
Because
you
there are
know,
men.
some of us are very selective with the slavish mentality that we draw.
There are still men who behave as if they're breeders.
Yes, because they have the slave, they like that slavish, that's wonderful.
The slave
Slavish
mentality that it may not be a hut in the same village, but it might be a hut in it might be a house in several villages in Antigua.
Yes.
Or in
So
the
you have
case of-
6 children with 6 different mothers, and what's different?
Or you might have a situation where it's even island to island.
When we return, we are going to speak about black slave owners and white slave owners and anything else you might want to add. But thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. I haven't done history in so long, but it's all coming back. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Miss Angela Black is here and Mr. KamaliMannix is here, and it's all about our history, starting from Africa, plantation life. And now we're at the stage where I want to discuss black slave owners. It goes back to the Ottoman Empire as well.
Yeah, it goes all the way back. But what was really interesting is when I found this, it was black slave owners in the Americas, because all you ever heard were
Caucasian.
Caucasian
Yeah.
or white planters. And then when I encountered that, I thought that was such an interesting topic, and it also shows you the different dimensions of slavery that we don't know about and we don't discuss.
So maybe some of the aspects of slavery we have not even discovered as yet.
Probably. But look, slavery was an economic institution. It was a way to get stuff done. And it transcended, in the Caribbean, it became black and white. Masters,
Yes.
the masters were white. Slave owners were normally white. Slaves were black. A white person could not
Negroes.
be a slave. Okay? And so what began to happen is there were some blacks who were free, and they were able to rise to that position of wealth that they needed people to help to farm their lands. And they bought slaves.
But I hope they didn't treat them as poorly as
Well, they were in Antigua, the one that was in Antigua, Barry Conyer Hart. He was a
benevolent.
benevolent.
Benevolent master.
He was a benevolent master. He was a kind master. And he had 2 daughters who I honestly believe should become national heroes. They were abolitionists in Antigua. They both married white men, white pastors.
Wow.
But they continued to teach slaves and so on how to read and write. They both died in 1833, which was when the Emancipation Act was passed.
in the
Yes.
British Parliament.
But strange enough, when they died, emancipation was just on the cusp of becoming a reality. So there was Barry Conyer Hart. In Barbados, there was Rachel Pringle. There is another gentleman, I can't remember his name right now. Rachel Pringle was a mulatto, and she owned a brothel. And again,
Wow.
it is using agency within a situation that you have no control over. Do I think it's an anomaly? Because one would think that if you are black and you know what blacks are going through, why on earth would you have slaves? In the US, the laws in the South, they began to pass a lot of laws to restrict the freeing of slaves. So this is what would happen. A black man purchases his wife's freedom, but on paper she's still a slave. She's called a nominal slave, but she lives like a free person.
So she's not absolutely free.
She is on paper a slave, so she's protected. Under the law, she would have to leave the state. If she gets her freedom, full freedom, she would have to leave the state after a certain length of time, because they pass so many laws to restrict your freedom. So they would say, okay, you are really and truly free, you know, but on paper you're still a slave. Then there were those slave masters in the US who would buy slaves for work. And there was one woman, she's of full African descent. She was a slave. She bought her freedom. She bought her children's freedom. And she bought a lot of slaves in the US and worked her plantation. beat the tar off their backsides if they did not do the work.
Wow.
So you had two different types of
Dynamics.
slave masters, black slave masters in the U.S. In Antigua, from what I've read about Barry Conyer Hart, he was a benevolent master. He owned a Pope's Head plantation in Antigua. Eventually, of course, the whites would not have liked him, and eventually his business went bust, and he went to Trinidad to try and make a better life for himself. But yeah,
But he was a good example.
of a black slave master.
Of a black slave master.
And the research goes on because it's really interesting. When you tell people that, they don't believe you.
Because we've been brainwashed to think that
A master has to be
a
white.
master has to be white.
But you did
No.
have black slave masters.
Yes.
And what I think the interesting dynamic about it was you found that, well, from my observations in the Spanish Caribbean especially, and in the Spanish world of the Americas, you found more black masters. Because what you found was the process of freeing a slave is called manumission. In the British and French territories, the amount of money you have to pay for manumission was set by a master based on what was seen as your value. So the reality is, Miss Black's value can actually be $10. But then because I didn't want it to be free, when the authorities come and go to say she's worth
40?
£400.
Oh.
So unless she can pay £400, then she cannot be freed.
It's
In the
extortionate.
Spanish society now, it was a situation where the price is more set by the government. So
Okay.
once I can work towards that amount, then I know it will be free. So what you found, the rate of freed blacks in the Spanish world was way
Far
greater
greater.
than what you found in the French and in the British.
Yes.
And so what you found is that in the Spanish society, where you had the mulattoes and the mestizos, which are blacks mixed with whites,
Right.
then it would be easy for them to say, okay, I'm not exactly fully black. Someone can buy
In-
40 or 50 and have an estate.
In Sandaman, this is before Sandaman became Haiti. In Sandaman, which is modern-day Haiti,
Yes.
Dutty Bookman, the guy who started the whole Haitian Revolution, first leader, his master was a black man. And not only that, but you had people of mixed race in Sandaman who owned slaves as well, and they were so wealthy. They did legislate against them in Sandaman to the point where they were saying women couldn't wear shoes, and those women were wearing diamonds on their feet instead of wearing shoes, just to prove a point that, hey, we're rich, what's the problem? You know, but they were people either of mixed race or full black who owned slaves in the Caribbean, in all parts of the Americas. Yeah.
Interesting. And when we speak about the Americas, we're talking about the U.S., Brazil,
The United States,
Latin
Brazil,
America.
yes, Latin America, the Caribbean.
Caribbean.
Yes.
And what I found interesting is that even when you go beyond the black masters, you also had a black privilege in terms of even with the slaves. Because what you found is that I might not necessarily be a master, but if, for example, I like Miss Black, or I like you, and I have 200 slaves, I will put you as the head driver.
Yes.
So now you don't get beaten. Your responsibility is to make sure they work. And if
Yes.
they don't work, you're allowed to beat them. In the similar sense, if you were a carriage driver, you were considered a favorite of the master. Because of course you transport me. If I want to go to town, you take me to town. If I want to go to the country, you're going to take me to the country. If I go to a ball, you take me to the ball. And you're often left unsupervised. Because if I go to the governor's ball, I'm inside of, for example, government house for 2, 3, 4 hours. You're with the
The
carriage in
master would
house.
really have
And
to
you live by
trust you.
yourself.
And look, if we were to put slave and master situation aside, there were some really interesting relationships between master and slaves. The same master who would cry because his mommy died is
Would
the same
cry if his
master.
slaves died.
He would cry for her, but he would beat the tar off somebody else's backside, you know, because the relationship,
It's individual, not
it's an
collective.
individual, and sometimes color may fade. It's only when it gets to a point of formality that you say, well, you know, I'm white, you're black, I'm master, you're slave. But you had some house slaves that you did not want to have anything to do with. because they were so wicked to the other slaves. I don't know if you ever saw Django. Okay, no, it's not a real representation.
Django Unchained?
Yes,
Yes,
the movie.
it's not a real representation
But you
of
did have
slavery.
some people.
You know, but the house,
the
what's his name?
I don't
What's his
remember
name
his
again?
name. Samuel L.
Samuel L. Jackson.
Yes, he played the
He
character.
played an excellent role as a house slave. And
Mm-hmm.
if I want my student to know what a real house slave was,
Well, let them watch
I
the
would
movie.
show that to him. You know
Django
why?
Unchained.
That the master trusted him so much, he could write his checks. He could write his checks for him. There were slaves who had that kind of relationship
With the
with
master.
their
And
master.
the ability, because they would have learned.
Yes,
Yeah.
they were more than just master and slave. They were
They were
friends.
friends.
They were friends.
confidants.
And other slaves did not like those type of house slaves. So in today's world, when somebody in the workplace does go and squeal on you to the boss,
And
you
they-
would say to them, "What y'all now? You bunch of house slaves."
Oh, that's an insult.
So, yeah, they're house slave because they go and
it did
squeal.
happen. So you had a situation where those said house slaves that were of such prestige with the master was a situation where, in addition to not being liked, the lesser slaves, so to speak, would be very afraid to anger them. Because if, for example, I am the driver of the master, and I say, you can imagine Paula go and tell me such and such. What? Yeah, that's it. Call the driver. Call the driver. Call Paula. How dare she tell you that? So you did have that dynamic, and it was just based off of friendship.
But I am sure those house slaves, they must have been lonely too, because
Sometimes.
deep within you, you want to be associated with your people.
You see, but this is the thing too. Imagine that you grow up with a child. You're not seeing the color of this child. You're seeing the fact that you grew up with a child. You love this child. This child is white. You're black. You're the child's slaves. But you love this child. You're going to be loyal. You understand? Something traumatic would have had to happen for that loyalty to be lost. And the child is going to be loyal to you. It's just human nature. If you adopt a child and you're all the child knows, the child is going to love you and you're going to love the child. The human element was still there within the institution. It's just that, like we said, it's peculiar.
Let's talk a little bit about punishment during slavery. I mean, punishment
You want
on
me-
the plantation.
You want to start?
Yeah, I'll start.
You've said anything I can imagine.
Anything.
happened.
Anything.
So start with breaking of the wheel.
There was no limitations as to what you can do to punish a slave.
Even unto
because the
death.
ideal thing about slavery, you know, finding a way to control you. And what I like about it, you don't have to punish everybody. Just get one example. And you can strike 3 into 200. So you had, you know, as we all know, the breaking of the wheel.
Yeah.
You know?
I read about that, and they did
Break
say it's
every part of
reserved
you.
for the most dangerous of criminals. And then when I read, I became a little bit angered, because it said if the executioner is a very skilled one, imagine we're talking about a skilled
The skill of how you kill.
Yeah, then that person is able to break bones
Without you dying.
without you dying.
So you feel the pain.
And right, and for several days, you could experience internal bleeding and loss of blood without dying. So if you all that pain, and for days, excruciating pain, you're not dying. Eventually, of course, you die.
Yes.
But like
The
you say,
suffering.
it's for other people as well to
be
see
afraid.
the suffering and decide, I don't want that for myself.
Yes.
Precisely.
You had another method, which was breaking you at the limbs. And essentially, it's like, you know, humans, you have 4 limbs, 2 hands, 2 feet. I'm going to tie 2 strong horses to each feet, 2 strong horses to each hand.
So the tail,
and
you're
then
basically-
at one given command, you're going to whip each animal and they run in different directions.
But these
so
are
they
for
will literally
slaves.
pull your limbs out of place. And if they're
These-
strong enough, they might even pull you apart.
These are for slaves that
Extremely dangerous
extremely,
and cause
the
revolts.
extremely dangerous slave. But
Traitors,
normally what they would
mass
have
killers, rebellious
is the whip.
slaves.
That is the
whip.
most common one, the whip.
Whipping.
And they would, if you're not working quickly enough, the whip is there, and you would have a driver who would, you know,
Well,
give
it's
you a
not
few
even
strokes.
just whipping. It's like banging.
Yes.
Because your flesh is torn.
And bang you, yes.
Your
So
flesh
a
is
lot of the whips
get blue.
were specially made. Some of them had like
The cat and nine
small
tail
pieces
thing.
of steel
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
end.
The end,
so
and
that
when it
it
rips
hits
you,
it
it
peels
rips the
into your skin
flesh.
and it pulls it down.
Yes.
You also had some masters who were cruel enough that they would cut parts of you. So if, for example, you're a slave known to run away, they will cut your entire foot off. So
Or
they
part
have
of
one
your foot off.
Or part of your foot off. Because if you ain't have no toes, if you don't have a foot, you can't run away. If you were known, for example, if I hit a driver, or if I hit maybe
A master, one of the white
child,
person. Good
yes,
Lord, you
they
lose
could
a
cut
hand.
off my hand. If I dare pass my place and hit the master himself, that's automatic execution.
You're dead.
You're dead.
Didn't even try.
And
Don't
in
even beg pardon.
Haiti, I understand they
Yes,
would
in
bury
Haiti,
the slave.
in Haiti, this was done. This was scientifically done. You had the punishers would come from plantation to plantation, so planters put up fences and so on. And these torturers, they knew the art of torturing you, and so they found all sorts of ways of torturing the slaves.
So they
I have-
experiment.
Yeah, man. These are
It was an
these
art.
and these are ways of torture that they practice in Europe too. So they would come. I've read C.L.R. James speaks about slaves who were dig a hole, bury them, you throw some molasses over their head, and ants will have their way with you. They either
can't
eat your
even
face
swat
off.
them.
No, you can't. You are either eaten alive by the ants, or you get the ants make a good meal of you until they decide to rescue you. In other case, again, they would stuff gunpowder up the rectum of the slave, put a wick in and blow you to pieces.
Light
Sometimes,
Yes, so
sometimes
you'd blow up.
in Sandaman, before the revolution occurred, sometimes you would have old slaves or slaves who are sick, and the master's burying them, and they're wide awake, and the slave is saying, "But master, I'm not even dead yet," you know.
But,
so
but they have no use for you.
I mean, punishment came in every style,
Do you realize
every
these
fashion.
people beat pregnant women
Until their babies are born.
Babies were prematurely
Born. Yes.
To talk about the wickedness of a master, there was an account given of a master who got fed up of one of his slaves and just took up the slave and tossed him into the boiling cane juice.
I've heard
Because
about
in order
that.
to make cane, you squeeze the cane, you boil the juice, and when you boil cane juice, I've literally seen it before. Cane juice
yes.
boils extremely hot.
like
And he
thick
got so
melted
fed up
sugar.
of the slave, he said, "Look, let me tell you something else, dash him inside of the boiling sugar."
And nothing for it.
And
Nothing for it.
nothing.
Like I've said to you, it's just one slave master who has ever been executed for
mistreating
for,
his
for
slave.
murdering his slave. They
Murdering.
referred, and he was hung, and that was in Nevis.
But there were hangings of slaves too.
Oh, on
Yeah,
a regular basis.
yeah, they were hanging of slaves. There was a regular basis,
But
and
not
that
the hanging
happened
of a
on
slave master.
but not of a
Right,
slave
right,
master. So
yeah.
that is, listen, slavery in the Americas, they always have at least one interesting case. You know, so Antigua has its one black slave master, Nevis has its one slave master that was murdered, was hung. You know, at least you have one case of each thing. Haiti had its revolution and it was a success. So we see all of this unfolding, but for all of the atrocities that planters or the masters committed against slaves,
They
the
went widely
enslaved,
unpunished.
they went widely even if they're found guilty, they are
A little tap on the hand.
yeah, you know,
No,
you may pay a
$5.
fine.
Yeah, that was
You
a
may
common
pay a
one.
fine. That is the most. You may pay a fine and stuff like that. So
Before you had the full-scale emancipation of slavery in the British Caribbean, the British government passed something called the Amelioration Act. And to ameliorate means to make better.
Right.
And so they introduced a whole bunch of laws, you know, they must pass between when a slave commits an
flogging.
offense and before
Women
you
should
beat
not be
them,
flogged
and to
and-
ensure that there was compliance, you had the appointment of stipendiary magistrates, which tended to be very old people from Britain. So then,
That looks tired and weary
Right.
and
So then
the stipendiary
enforcement-
magistrate was after emancipation.
Right. So then the enforcement of a lot of these things was so weak that you could literally do anything. Even in Antigua, Even in Antigua,
I helped
maybe
my
about
son with
60 years or so ago.
reviewing his history,
Yeah.
SBA, and they were talking about these
The stipendiary
Magistrate. This
And-
is after
and they-
emancipation.
right,
Antigua
and they
actually
weren't
got
even
one
keen- they weren't even
because
keen
we
to
didn't have
do any
apprenticeship,
work.
but it was to make sure that apprenticeship was working.
Yes.
But going back to what you were saying about the Amelioration Act, which was passed in 1823, that was the first time Britain had a collective set of laws for its colonies. And they were vexed. That is why we had the 1831 revolt in Antigua. We will talk about that at another time, I guess. But that is why, because they tried to change the
The
market
Amelioration
day,
Act,
the market day from a Sunday to a Saturday, and the slaves got vexed. And the slave burned down about 16 plantations. And nobody knows about this. It doesn't
So
seem.
slaves are behaving like Black Lives Matter in
Yes.
the
See,
States.
the slaves were, the thing about it is
The
like,
slaves
they
had
a very
agency,
high
you know.
tolerance, but they had a moment where they could take
Yes,
no
the
more.
slaves had agency, you know.
And that's the danger.
Yes,
That's
people
the
snap.
danger.
that's the danger.
When people decide,
Enough is enough.
you don't have to be forced to say enough is enough. When collectively people decide this is enough, not one more day,
Then they
then it
snap.
becomes problematic.
And then you brave death.
Then it becomes problematic.
Then you brave death. You brave everything because
Even
You
if I
You're
are
die,
just fed up.
willing to
Yeah.
be martyred for
Yes.
your
Even
even if I
cause.
die,
Yes.
I'm going to do it.
Because at this stage, there's no turning back.
And this is why the
And
planters.
it's called a revolution.
Yes, this is why the planters used to build their houses on top of a hill.
So that they could
And
see.
even at Fort James and some of the forts, some of the cannons were turned inland.
Yes.
In case there's a slave uprising.
Yes.
They were very
They were
fearful.
so afraid of themselves.
They were very afraid of the slaves.
But if you had all
And what
these
made it-
thousands and thousands
Right.
of black
And
people
you
and
see,
just a few.
That was the problem.
Yeah.
The ratio of
Yeah.
white to black was for every
one is about 10.
you had 10.
And-
So if you had 10 white people, you probably have 100 black people.
And I
to
don't
complement it.
understand up to now why slavery continued for so long.
Because of the
Because
psychological
seasoning,
control.
That was
The
the point of the
seasoning.
Because of the
seasoning.
psychological
You break
control.
them so you make sure that they are slaves.
Well,
Because of the
listen.
you would be surprised what you can do. Go and read up on Stockholm Syndrome.
No, I know what you can do psychologically.
When you mess
I
with
know what
somebody,
you can do
remember, you know,
psychologically.
that still exists to today now.
Of course.
And you know who perpetuates it? Black people.
We're at the revolts. And the slaves who influenced emancipation.
Yes.
And I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, 176 years ago, the Amistad. I watched that movie, and what I take away from the movie, what was it? Give us freedom. Give us freedom in the courtroom. Give
Yeah.
us freedom.
Well, that's a part of the drama.
The theatrics of it.
Theatrics, yes. But there was indeed a ship called the Amistad. And again,
Incidentally, friendship. A
Yes.
ship called friendship.
yes,
Friendship.
one of the first slave
And
ships
you
that left
You're
Africa was
transporting
called
slaves.
Jesus.
Lord, forgive me.
So the Amistad is actually, there was another ship that left Africa with a unit of slaves. And then they went to Cuba, and those who were going to the U.S. were was it the U.S. they were headed for? I don't remember where
The
they were
United
headed
States.
for. But there was a consignment of slaves that were put on the Amistad. And on their way to their destination, the slaves revolted. The slaves got free of their shackles, and they took over the ship and landed in
Mutiny
the
on the
U.S.
Bounty.
Incidentally, they were set free because at the time, slave trading was illegal in Africa. And what the lawyers had to do was to prove that these slaves came directly from Africa and not Cuba. So they had to prove that they were not Spanish-born slaves, but rather
But
African-born slaves.
But you know, they would have gotten away with it because they basically hijacked the vessel and demanded to be returned to Africa. But because they weren't knowledgeable and seaworthy, the captains, during the day, they set a course that seemingly was towards Africa, but at nights they went in a different direction. Eventually, it was forced to dock in Connecticut.
Yes.
there was always an attempt at revolt even on the Middle Passage. And remember I spoke to you about the Duke of Argyll that
Yes.
came to Antigua.
That came
There
to
was an
Antigua.
attempted revolt on the Duke of Argyll too. I tell you, Antigua is the first in almost everything. So there was an attempted revolt on the Duke of Argyll, but the captain of the ship, Newton, he was able to put the revolt down. So it didn't happen completely like it happened on the
On the
Amistad.
Amistad. King Court, this was not a revolt, but
No.
it's almost, it's like a
Yes.
conspiracy.
Yes.
And that was on land in Antigua.
That was land in
and
Antigua.
Barbuda.
But before that, we had one in 1701 with the master, like I mentioned it before. And then we had an actual revolt in 1831. But let me speak about
King
King
Court
Court.
was 1736.
Yes, it was. And again, if that was a successful revolt,
Almost successful.
if it was successful, we would have been the first free black republic in the Caribbean and not Haiti.
But
Somebody spoke about it.
Some
And
accounts have revealed that he should not have been brutally killed in that manner because there wasn't enough evidence to prove that they were actually going to kill the white people.
but we know that was the plan.
Well, I was reading something online that said it was harsh punishment not having sufficient evidence. So you're saying as a historian,
Slaves were killed for even less evidence than that. Slaves were killed for
With no
stealing.
evidence.
So to hear that there was this conspiracy with King Court, of course he's going to die in the most
and
horrific
87
death.
of his followers.
Approximately,
Yeah.
yes. I think, if I'm not mistaken, because there's so much history in my head right now, I think his head was hung on a pike. He was one of
St.
them.
John's, yes.
Yes, just to remind the slaves, the other slaves.
This is going to be
some
the
of them were
outcome.
transported, some of them were lashed, but the core planners were executed.
Remember I said at the beginning of this segment, I'm also talking about people who influenced emancipation. And so Mary Prince.
Mary Prince. Mary Prince
Yes.
need to be declared a national hero in
You've
Antigua.
been relentless
Yes,
about that.
yes, I am. And she's already a national hero in Bermuda, but I don't have a problem with her being a national hero here. She was not born in Antigua, she was born in Bermuda. But as a slave, she requested to come to Antigua. She was badly treated by her owners, and they eventually took her to England, to Britain. There, with the weather and so on, she had severe rheumatism and all of that, arthritis, and they were very cruel to her. And it was the women, British white women, who actually assisted her with her chores and so on. And eventually, when she went to Britain, when she was taken to Britain, she was essentially a free woman. Because in 1772, the Somerset case and the
Said that
Mansfield
slavery was
judgment
not
says that
lawful.
slavery is not lawful in
Black
England
people in
anymore.
England were free.
So she was essentially a free woman, and they took her to the abolitionist group, and they recorded her story. Now, what they did with her story, along with people like Equiano,
Yes.
they disseminated that information throughout Britain to people who could vote. And so they read her story. So you call this, and her story sensitized those people and made them develop a hatred for slavery.
And made
to the
demands
point,
of their
and made demands of
politicians.
their politicians.
And this thing.
Right, Mary Prince is a black woman. She was a slave. She was a black
But you
slave.
know that's not going to be
She was a
included in
woman.
the formal history.
She was a woman.
syllabus.
That's because we don't have it in our syllabus. And I preach it to my students all the time. And she got married in Antigua. She wanted to come back to Antigua, but had she done so, she would have been a slave again. I don't know if anybody gets it like I do.
Well,
But
maybe we're
she-
not as passionate about it as
she
you
was
are. because
instrumental.
well, not me, because
maybe you
I'm
don't
not a
know.
historian. I heard it from
No, because
you.
which
and
black man is going to be able to influence emancipation? And at that time, women had no political voice.
Well, exactly.
But with her story, she had a political voice. She influenced the political voice of the day, if you can understand what I'm saying.
So you know what what point that is bringing clear to me. sometimes we think we don't have the power because we're not in a prestigious position. But even persons who are not in those lofty positions can influence a process.
Yes.
And that is why people need to understand it's important to vote in an election.
Yes.
The power in an election
Yes.
is not the power of the politicians.
Yes.
It's the power of the individual votes.
Yes.
Hence, we need to understand that we are powerful people.
Yes.
So I will always encourage people to vote. What are your thoughts on revolts and emancipation?
Well, when you look at resistance and revolt, there are two categories.
Yes.
You have passive resistance and then you have active resistance. So then passive resistance is simple. And I love the slaves, you know, black people have been black people from since day one. They will do any and anything to oppose, eh? It's as simple as this. You're working on the plantation and you broke every single tool that the master gives to you.
Deliberately?
Deliberately. Or
to prove a point.
To prove a point. As simple as this. When, of course, women go through their cycle on a monthly basis, I think the masters have a little bit of leniency in terms of, you know, making them excuse themselves, you know, so that they can not be around everybody else.
Don't tell me they have it for 2 weeks.
And you would have some women, oh, how you mean, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, just so that they didn't have to work.
It could be legitimate.
It could be legitimate.
They had
But it couldn't be for
fibroids.
everybody.
It could be.
Right? It couldn't be for everybody.
And sometimes the women would have what is known as petticoat rebellions.
Yes.
Where they will just stop working and start cussing one another, just so that they're not working. So they basically confuse the whole issue.
And so the drivers would just be there like, okay, I can't necessarily beating them because, you know, women having arguments.
Yes.
And then you had active resistance. Active resistance is where you have the revolts.
Yeah.
What you had in the Caribbean is that you had some islands particularly, and you know, it's also probably a complement of conditions and the size of the slave populations that had revolts a lot. I think Jamaica and Guyana has the record for like the most consistent
Haiti had
revolts.
quite a few.
Of course.
But the Haitian Revolution, there's only one revolution. That's the Haitian Revolution.
But they still had skirmishes.
Yes, they did, of
many
course.
skirmishes.
That's human nature.
Let me explain something to you about Haiti. Haiti was special in that when Haiti became the property of France, legitimately became the property of France with the Treaty of Ryswick, the land was very fertile. People were just coming in now from France to set up plantations. For every acre on a plantation, you needed one slave. So imagine that you're bringing 300-400 acres of land on the cultivation. You need 400 slaves.
Yes.
And they were beginning now to literally dump slaves into Sandoman.
Yeah.
Dump slaves into
Sandoman,
which is now Haiti. And when that happened, you don't have proper seasoning taking place, and you're bringing soldiers from Africa. They had a fighting spirit, still have a fighting spirit today. With the other countries now, sometimes revolts tended to happen when planters angered the slave. If there was a case where there is starvation, that was happening during the King Court session at that time. If there was a point where there was starvation, where slaves are not
being fed or treated
properly, eventually they would rise up. So you tended to find that. Or there could also be where you had African people from Africa who came and refused to accept their life, and they would start a revolt.
Yeah. Ms. Black and Mr. Mannix, we've come to the end of part 2 of our 3-part program. And you've said on a number of occasions that Antigua is known for being first in a lot of instances. We're all Antiguans, right?
Yes.
Okay. It is the first time on the Paula Show for the 7 almost years that we've been hosting this program that we've done a 3-part program. The first time. So you guys have made history on the Paula Show. Clap for yourself.
Give me a high five, man.
So thank you for staying with us on the Paula Show. Please join us next week for part 3 of our 3-part program with historians Miss Angella Black and Mr. KamaliMannix. Thank you for viewing and have a good evening. Goodbye.
color show is on.